The difference between people who walk free and people who die in prison is not the evidence. It is who controls the story that gets told about the evidence. In 1992, a 2-year-old girl named Haley Olson stopped breathing in her crib. Her father, Cameron Todd Willingham, called 911. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was fully engulfed. 3 of his daughters were dead. Willingham survived, and within 24 hours, investigators were not looking for a cause. They were building a case. A fire investigator walked through the charred wreckage and pointed at scorch patterns on the floor, char depth near the door, glass with a crackled texture they called alligatoring. He said these were definitive proof of arson, proof of accelerant, proof of murder. What he did not say, what nobody said out loud, is that none of those markers had ever been validated by a single peer-reviewed scientific study. Not one. Willingham was executed by the state of Texas in 2004, and the science that killed him was already falling apart. Here is what you were never told about the forensic science that fills American courtrooms. For most of the 20th century, prosecutors stood up in front of juries and presented expert witnesses the same way a magician presents a trick. Confidently, with authority, with props. And juries believed them because the witnesses had badges or PhDs or decades of experience. What nobody checked, not the defense, not the judge, and certainly not the mainstream media, is whether the underlying science actually worked. In 2009, the National Academy of Sciences released a report that should have broken open every news cycle in the country. It examined the forensic disciplines used every single day in criminal courts: hair analysis, bite mark comparison, blood spatter interpretation, arson investigation. The report's conclusion was devastating. Most of these disciplines had never been subjected to rigorous scientific testing. There was no established error rate, no standardized methodology, no blinded validation studies. They were, in the Academy's own language, disciplines built on assumption rather than science. That report was published 15 years ago. Courts are still using most of these methods today, and if you think that could never touch your life, to understand how this happened, you have to go back further than Willingham. You have to go back to a small town in Mississippi and a man named Stephen Hayne. Hayne performed an estimated 1,500 to 1,800 autopsies per year for the state of Mississippi during the 1980s and 1990s. That is physically impossible. The standard accepted caseload for a medical examiner is 250 per year. Hayne was doing 6 times that. He was the state's go-to forensic pathologist, and prosecutors loved him because he almost always gave them what they needed. He testified in hundreds of criminal cases. He connected bite marks to defendants. He determined cause of death in ways that supported whatever theory the prosecution was building. His partner, a forensic odontologist named Michael West, was equally prolific. West claimed to have a technique called ABFO No. 2 bite mark analysis. He said he could look at a wound on a victim's body and match it with near certainty to a specific person's teeth. In 1993, a 3-year-old girl named Haley Ollinger was murdered in Mississippi. West examined her body and said the bite marks on her skin matched a man named Levon Brooks. Brooks was convicted. He went to prison for life. Then, in 2008, DNA evidence proved he didn't do it. The real killer confessed. And when investigators reviewed West's work, they discovered something horrifying. In some cases, bite marks on his photographs appeared to change between the first examination and the second. Marks that weren't there before suddenly matched the suspect. The scientific community didn't just question West's methods. They expelled him from professional organizations, the American Board of Forensic Odontology, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Both pushed him out. And yet his testimony had already sent innocent people to prison. The Hayne and West story is not an isolated failure, it is a symptom, and the deeper you look, the worse it gets. The FBI ran a hair analysis unit for decades. Examiners testified that they could match a strand of hair found at a crime scene to a specific individual with high confidence. It sounded like science. It looked like science. In 2015, the FBI admitted that at least 90% of their hair analysts had given flawed testimony in criminal trials. 90%. The review covered 268 cases. In 257 of them, examiners overstated the strength of their evidence. 32 of those defendants had already been executed or died in prison. Let that land. People were dead before anyone admitted the science was broken. And it was not just the FBI. Arson investigation used the same folklore-based markers that were used against Willingham for generations. Bite mark analysis is still admitted as evidence in most states today, even though a 2016 PCAST report, President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, explicitly stated that bite mark analysis has never been shown to be a valid and reliable forensic method. Think about what this means for you, not abstractly, personally. If you are ever accused of something, falsely or otherwise, the expert who takes that stand might be performing science theater. And a jury of 12 people with no scientific background will believe every word. So how did this last so long? The answer is not incompetence. The answer is incentive. Forensic experts who testified for the prosecution got called back. They got paid. They built careers. The system rewarded certainty over accuracy. A medical examiner who said, "I cannot determine cause of death with confidence," got replaced by one who would say, "I can." Defense attorneys, especially in cases involving poor or minority defendants, often had no budget to hire competing experts. The expert who showed up was the expert the jury heard. There was also a cultural blind spot. The TV version of forensic science, CSI, Bones, Criminal Minds, trained an entire generation of jurors to believe that forensic evidence is definitive. Researchers actually named this the CSI effect. Studies found that jurors expected forensic evidence in every case and gave it near absolute weight when it appeared. The prosecution knew this, the experts knew this, and they used it. The courtroom became a stage, the lab coat became a costume, and the verdict became a performance. In 2019, the Innocence Project identified forensic science misconduct or invalid forensic evidence as a contributing factor in 24% of the wrongful convictions it had overturned through DNA testing, nearly 1 in 4. Not bad luck, not isolated mistakes, a systemic pattern built on evidence that was never real science at all. Now here is where it gets deeply uncomfortable, because reform is happening, slowly, painfully, and against enormous institutional resistance. The Texas Forensic Science Commission was created specifically in the aftermath of the Willingham execution to examine whether the arson science used against him was valid. Their investigator, a nationally recognized fire scientist named Craig Baylor, concluded that the evidence used to convict Willingham was not supported by modern fire investigation science. His report was ready in 2009. The day before the commission was scheduled to discuss it, then-Governor Rick Perry replaced 3 members of the commission. The meeting was canceled. The report sat. Willingham had been dead for 5 years by then. In Mississippi, Stephen Hayne was eventually pushed out of his role as the state's de facto medical examiner, but only after decades, only after hundreds of cases, and only after journalists, specifically a reporter named Radley Balco, spent years digging, documenting, and publishing what the system refused to acknowledge. The system does not fix itself. It gets fixed when enough people know what is actually happening. That is why you are watching this video. Because the version of justice you learned about in school, objective, scientific, fair, is not always the version operating in courtrooms right now. And the only people with any power to demand better are the ones who understand what went wrong. There is a book that documents the Hayne and West story in devastating detail. It is called The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist by Radley Balco and Tucker Carrington. If this story has shaken you, and it should, that book will give you the full picture. It names names. It traces the legal cases. It shows exactly how 2 men operating inside a broken system destroyed innocent lives for decades. I also want to recommend another resource for anyone who wants to dig deeper into forensic fraud as a systemic issue. There is a comprehensive breakdown called Forensic Fraud that documents case after case where evidence was fabricated, overstated, or simply invented. Understanding how this evidence manipulation actually works is not just interesting, it is protective. One more thing. A lot of people research cases like these online. Sensitive legal searches, court documents, wrongful conviction records. If you are the kind of person who goes deep on this kind of research, you want a VPN. Not because you are doing anything wrong, but because your search history is a data trail, and data trails have a way of being used in ways you did not consent to. A VPN keeps your research private. It encrypts your connection so your curiosity stays yours. I'll put a trusted recommendation in the description. Use it, especially when you are reading things that powerful institutions would rather you didn't. So what do you actually do with this information? First, understand that forensic evidence is not automatically credible. If you ever serve on a jury, and statistically you will, you have the right to ask whether the science presented has been peer-reviewed, validated, and subjected to proficiency testing. You are allowed to be skeptical. You are supposed to be skeptical. Second, follow the Innocence Project. Follow journalists like Radley Balko. Read the work of scientists like Brandon Garrett, who has spent his career documenting how forensic evidence goes wrong in courtrooms. These are the people doing the work that the system refuses to do for itself. Third, share this video. Not because of the algorithm, because of your aunt, your brother, your coworker, your neighbor. The people who still believe that a lab coat in a courtroom means certainty. The people who have never heard the name Cameron Todd Willingham. The people who do not know that in the United States, at least 375 people have been exonerated through DNA evidence after being convicted by courts that said the evidence was airtight. Every one of those 375 people had a verdict delivered with confidence. Every single one of those verdicts was wrong. The science looked official, it looked credible, and it was built on nothing. If this video hit differently than you expected, good. That means you are paying attention. Subscribe to Dark Files for more stories that the official version does not tell you. We cover the cases that fall through the cracks, the systems that protect themselves instead of you, the science that was never science at all. Hit the bell. Leave a comment with the case that disturbed you most. And if you know someone who still trusts everything they see in a courtroom, send them this. They deserve to know. Disclaimer: this video discusses real events for educational purposes. All persons are presumed innocent until proven guilty.